Meaning Mondays number 13. So this is week 13, so we're on page 13 of Maps of Meaning. And I'm going to add in a couple of videos this week instead of just the PowerPoint. And I just watched this talk in Slovenia that he gave for his 12 Rules tour. There's a lot of good clips to take from this, and I would recommend you watch the whole video. But I'm going to focus on this particular point. He does a very good summary of what he thinks therapy is all about, and I think it relates very well to page 13 of Maps of Meaning, and so far from what we read of Maps of Meaning. And then I want to also join it with this this part of the Eric Weinstein Joe Rogan Experience that was almost 4 hours long. So this part is coming in at 1 hour and 10 minutes. So I know a lot of people don't have time to watch all of these, so many hours of these podcasts, but so far I've been trying to fit them in as best I can for my channel. I oftentimes can't fit everything in, so I do rely on stuff you guys send to me to take a more close look at it. I think someone was telling me about this video last night, and I just happened to be almost done with it, so that was kind of a funny coincidence. So before I get to these videos, I think I'm going to do a read through the page so we know where we're at. And I want to pay attention to certain words that he's using this time around. And so let's begin. We left off up here in this, I finished this paragraph last week where he says the age-old problem of deriving the ought from the is help us see how what we must do might be inextricably associated with what it is that we are. Pay attention to the words here, inextricably associated. So I don't get the sense that there's a strong determination of what we must do here, as if we're determined the way Sam Harris might think. I think, again, it's the middle road between a hard determinism and free will, which I think is the proper balance when you come down to it. So proper analysis of mythology of the type proposed here is not mere discussion of historical events enacted upon the world stage, as the traditionally religious might have it. And it is not mere investigation of primitive belief, as the traditionally scientific might presume. Now, I just want to go over that sentence again because it's interesting how he phrased that. And of course, he's going to say, I heard him say initially, I believe he said he rewrote every sentence 30 times. And Owen Benjamin might point out, oh, he's lying now. He's now saying 50 times. Bullshit. I just think it's kind of funny. That to me is a funny thing. I hope Owen is saying it in a funny manner, but sometimes it's hard to tell because he can play it straight or he can play it serious very well. Maybe that's why he started acting too. So proper analysis. Okay, so it's proper. Of mythology, the type proposed here is not mere discussion of historical, quote-unquote, historical events enacted upon the world stage as the traditionally religious might have it. Now, he's going back to how he first framed this in page 1. The world of action, as a forum for action, that's the mythological world, and the world as a place of objects, and that's the scientific world. And then how and where are the domains separated, and how can we define the borders of each domain? And sometimes they're confused, and sometimes each looks on the other with disdain. So the traditionally religious he's talking about here, and then he goes the traditionally scientific might presume. So there are some presumptions that the modern scientific minds are making. And so it's not the mere investigation of primitive belief. There's other ways. The other way I would say this, and I'm going to be talking about this, I think, in my next Peterson paradox video, we do tend to think of it as a primitive belief. But maybe rather, language is so important, and I'm going to get into that too. And it's obvious how that's how Jordan came to the world stage. It's this argument over language. So instead of primitive belief, I would like to say it's a foundational belief structure. And oh, you know what? I forgot to pull up this video of Jordan in one of his Sam Harris debates. I wanted to use that but you're probably all familiar with it. If you're this far along in this series, you probably know everything that Jordan has ever said more than I do. So anyway, so let's move on. It is instead the examination, analysis, and subsequent incorporation of an edifice of meaning, which contains within it hierarchical organization of experiential valence. So now this is what he was trying to, instead, Sam Harris was making the presumption of primitive belief, and now I was saying I like the words foundational belief structure, and this is coming from, I'm trying to pull it from this sentence here, where he says it's the examination. He's trying to use, a more scientific way of looking at it, the examination, analysis, and subsequent incorporation of an edifice of meaning, which contains within it hierarchical organization of experiential valence. Again, it's all pulling from what, obviously, as a good writer would do, he's pulling from what he just laid out in the previous pages. The mythic imagination is concerned with the world in the manner of the phenomenologist, who seeks to discover the nature of subjective reality, instead of concerning himself with description of the objective world. That's incredibly important. I know a lot of people were talking to Paul Vanderklay and trying to get him into reading the phenomenologists, what they had to say about being and reality. And in some sense, there is nothing but the subjective reality. There's just, the idea that Sam Harris and the other scientism people like to project is that there is such a thing as the objective world. And this is something that might, to a modern mind, that sounds right. But what in reality, when you start to look at things more closely, as Jordan has, and many others, Jordan is really just a good synthesizer of this knowledge. And he's a good speaker. He's charismatic, and he has a way of relating it to people's everyday lives. That's why 12 Rules is probably such a big seller, is because he's trying to bring these lofty ideas that he has here and that he's accumulated in this book, that he's gathered from all these other sources, and he brought them down to the act of what you do in your day-to-day life, like cleaning your room. So it's really all about subjective reality. You cannot help but have a subjective experience. As much as you are a scientist and you try to weed out all possibilities of subjectivity, it's still there because you are an observer. There's no getting around the you there. Myth and the drama that is part of myth provide answers in image to the following question: how can the current state of experience be conceptualized in abstraction with regards to its meaning? And now here I would say that William Blake would have a problem with this constant conceptualization and abstractions that go on here. But I'll just leave that as an aside. And also how he says it's provide, so the drama that is part of myth provide answers in image. Now, he recently in an interview said that he sort of thinks in images, and then he said I think he mostly thinks in words. But he also, I believe, said in that interview that, I forget who the interviewer was, I think it was about a month ago, that when he learns something, he sort of puts it in a slot within his theory that he's been building for the last 40 years. And so that's how he remembers things, is that he remembers where it fits in his theory. And then once he knows the location of where it is in the theory, then he remembers what it is. And he related it to some old memory technique, something memory castle or something, where you imagine your brain as a house or a castle, as it were, and you walk through the house and you put down your information in certain places. You hang it on the wall as a picture, or you put it on the shelf as a book, or whatever you might want to think of it as. And so then when you're trying to remember the specifics of it, you kind of walk through that house and imagine picking up the book, and the information will sort of come to you. And I guess that's related to how the brain structures these these neuronal connections and so forth. So the question, how can the current state of experience be conceptualized in abstraction with regards to its meaning? And then he has, what is this, double parenthetical? I can't quite see because my monitor is kind of really far away from me, and I really need glasses for this. Which means it's subjective, biologically predicated, socially constructed, emotional relevance, or motivational significance. And that relates to, I believe, this part I wanted to show you in the video between Sam Harris and Jordan, where it was like the last 2 or 3 minutes of the debate, and he sort of summarized everything very well, talking about the biological structures that we evolved to have in order to deal with reality. And so I think this is where he's sort of getting at, but he's adding in socially, the social construction to it as well here. Meaning means implication for behavioral output. Now, in some sense, I'm interjecting a lot here, like every sentence, but this is just the way the page is laid out. It's sort of calling out to be commented on in every sentence. So when you start to learn a subject like, let's say, theology, there's a certain lingo and that you have to learn to understand what's being written. And when you open up any philosophy book, there's going to be sort of a section where they define the terms that they're using, because they're trying to get at something that normal language can't quite get at. So they're sort of twisting terms or redefining things, or they're making sure that you understand what they mean by what they say. And so the same is with Jordan in this book, which is sort of like a mix of philosophy and psychology and theology to some extent, where he has his own lingo, or he's making sure you understand what he means. When he says something like meaning means implication for behavioral output, that's again coming from page 1 or 2. The implication for behavior, that's what meaning is, and that's what the narrative gives you, that's what myth gives you, that's what the mythological drama gives you, this meaning, which means implication for behavioral output. And he gave the example very early on about the child exploring and finding a glass vase, I think, and she learned, that the glass vase, the meaning of that, there was some kind of danger about it, especially when in the presence of mother, because mother seemed to warn the child against going near the glass vase. So there's some kind of meaning there. The meaning is don't go near the glass vase. Logically, therefore, myth presents information relevant to the most fundamental of moral problems. What should be? What should be done? Parenthetically. The desirable future, the object of what should be, can be conceptualized only in relationship to the present, which serves at least as a necessary point of contrast and comparison. To get somewhere in the future presupposes being somewhere in the present. Furthermore, the desirability of the place traveled to depends on the valence of the place vacated. The question of what should be, what line should be traveled, therefore has contained within it, so to speak, 3 subqueries, which might be formulated as follows. Number 1, what is? What is the nature, parenthetically, meaning, the significance, of the current state of experience? Number 2, what should be? To what desirable or valuable end should that state be moving? Number 3, how should we therefore act? What is the nature of the specific processes by which the present state might be transformed into that which is desired? Now, this is all reminiscent of Jordan speaking about his future and past authoring programs. Clearly, this is the groundwork for that. And this is where I want to link in the Eric Weinstein video a little bit. It has something to do with this part of the page, but also a little bit more to do with the Peterson paradox, and I'm kind of just running through it a little bit before I attempt to do the paradox video. So, active apprehension of the goal of behavior, conceptualized in relationship to the interpreted present, serves to constrain or provide determinate framework for the evaluation of ongoing events, which emerge as a consequence of current behavior. The goal is an imaginary state consisting of a place, quote unquote, a place of desirable motivation or affect, a state that only exists in fantasy as something potentially preferable to the present. And this is very reminiscent to me of William Blake and his emphasis on the mental and presentness of reality and the imagination and the superiority of that over all else. Construction of the goal therefore means establishment of a theory about the ideal relative status of motivational states, about the good. And again, this is exactly what he was trying to get at with Sam Harris. This imagined future constitutes a vision of perfection, so to speak, generated in the light of all current knowledge, at least under optimal conditions, to which specific and general aspects of ongoing experience are continually compared. This vision of perfection is the promised land, mythologically speaking, conceptualized as a spiritual domain, a psychological state, a political utopia, a state literally speaking, or both simultaneously. We answer the question, what should be, by formulating an image of the desired future. And this last part is where it's almost, where this philosophy and psychology almost basically touches on what you might say is theology. But he's so carefully worded it here that he can, perhaps Owen Benjamin would say, weasel out of a theology. And Jung was often accused of this as well, but Jung always made sure he never talked about the metaphysics of God. He talked of the God image. And here again, Peterson is trying to be very careful in how he approaches this. The promised land, mythologically speaking, conceptualized, this is a concept now, as a spiritual domain. And he puts parenthetically, a psychological state, or a political utopia, or both simultaneously. And now, more recently, when Paul Vanderklay had a question about, what is this when you pick up your burden and you're carrying it up this hill, what's at the top of the hill? And the guys from Rebel Wisdom asked Peterson this, and Peterson looked like he'd had a long day. He kind of seemed a little bit prickly. And he said, of course, it's the kingdom. I think he said it's the kingdom of God. Like, that's what you're working. That's what picking up the heavy burden and going uphill with it. This is so that you can establish the kingdom of God. Now, how are you reading? How are you reading this? Is he talking the psychological state here? Is he talking about a political utopia? I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine he's talking about a political utopia, given how much he criticizes people for trying to create utopias. That seems to be a non-starter. And yet, it seems that if you're not trying to create the political utopia, and you are picking up that burden, and you are walking uphill, you're cleaning your room, you're living your ordinary life, but in the best way that's possible for you to live it. It seems like if everybody did that individually, the net result in the community, your local community, your family, your local community, and pushing that outwards towards your larger communities, like a nation state, it seems inevitable that such a state might become a utopia. It might be the kingdom of God. I mean, like, who knows, right? And like, that's what he always says about Jesus and the resurrection. Who knows how or what could happen if someone put themselves together perfectly, as we believe Jesus was. If he was the perfect man, if he lived a sinless life, if he was hitting the mark, if you look at the original meaning of what sin was, and Peterson goes over this in his biblical lectures. I mean, I've known this for a long time myself, as I was thinking about going into seminary myself in the Lutheran Church. I sort of read into all of this stuff years ago. But so sin, if you're not missing the mark, that means you're hitting the target. If you're hitting every target and you're never missing, like, what could life be like? What could you be like? what might Jesus have been like? So I'm actually going to read a little bit from the Red Book, because I think the Red Book also touches on this, and then I'm going to get into the videos. And it's interesting. I like reading from the Red Book and comparing it to Peterson's language, because a lot of people are not familiar with the Red Book or Carl Jung that much. They know Peterson is a big fan of Jung, but maybe they haven't been able to get into Jung themselves. So I like giving a little bit of a sample every now and again. And the Red Book really deserves its own video series like Maps of Meaning, like I'm doing with Mo Meaning Mondays. I just don't have time right now to devote to a series just on the Red Book. And the Red Book, I think, is so, it's really like so powerful that it's just something that you just have to hear or read for yourself. I'm just going to read the words. I try not to comment on it because it's all right there. You know, I think any commenting I might do might just disturb it for you. The only thing I will say is that if you're not familiar with it, I've sort of introduced the book a couple of times in previous videos, so I feel like I'd be repetitive if I keep introducing the book every time I read from it. But what I will say is here that Jung did not write the Red Book as a prescription for you as a reader of it. In fact, Jung never published the book. He never perhaps wanted it to be published necessarily. So this is not a prescription, and right at the beginning he does lay out saying that this is my way, and it's not going to be your way, and I'm not telling you to do as I did. So you have to understand, although this language seems prescriptive, this is Jung's imaginings talking to him. These people he was visualizing in his active imagination, these characters are speaking to him, and in this case it's the spirit of the depths. And you're going to hear a little bit of perhaps Nietzsche in here, and you're going to hear, of course, this is going to be sounding very similar to Jordan Peterson, but Jung, of course, is probably echoing, through much of the book, he's echoing some of Nietzsche and some criticisms of Nietzsche as well. So it begins, how hard is fate? If you take a step toward your soul, you will at first miss the meaning. You will believe that you have sunk into meaninglessness, into eternal disorder. You will be right. Nothing will deliver you from disorder and meaninglessness, since this is the other half of the world. Your God is a child, so long as you are not childlike. Is the child order, meaning, or disorder, caprice? Disorder and meaninglessness are the mother of order and meaning. Order and meaning are things that have become and are no longer becoming. You open the gates of the soul to let the dark flood of chaos flow into your order and meaning. If you marry the ordered to the chaos, you produce the divine child, the supreme meaning beyond meaning and meaninglessness. You are afraid to open the door? I too was afraid, since we had forgotten that God is terrible. Christ taught God is love, but you should know that love is also terrible. I spoke to a loving soul, and as I drew nearer to her, I was overcome by horror, and I heaped up a wall of doubt, and did not anticipate that I thus wanted to protect myself from my fearful soul. You dread the depths. It should horrify you, since the way of what is to come leads through it. You must endure the temptation of fear and doubt, and at the same time acknowledge to the bone that your fear is justified and your doubt is reasonable. How otherwise could it be a true temptation and a true overcoming? Christ totally overcomes the temptation of the devil, but not the temptation of God to good and reason. Christ thus succumbs to cursing. You still have to learn this, to succumb to no temptation, but to do everything of your own will. Then you will be free and beyond Christianity. I have had to recognize that I must submit to what I fear. Yes, even more, that I must even love what horrifies me. We must learn such from that saint who was disgusted by the plague infections. She drank the pus of plague boils and became aware that it smelled like roses. The acts of the saint were not in vain. In everything regarding your salvation and the attainment of mercy, you are dependent on your soul. Thus no sacrifice can be too great for you. If your virtues hinder you from salvation, discard them, since they have become evil to you. The slave to virtue finds the way as little as the slave to vice. If you believe that you are the master of your soul, then become her servant. If you were her servant, make yourself her master, since she needs to be ruled. These should be your first steps. During the 6 further nights, the spirit of the depths was silent in me, since I swayed between fear, defiance, and nausea, and was wholly the prey of my passion. I could not and did not want to listen to the depths. But on the 7th night, the spirit of the depths spoke to me. Look into your depths, pray to your depths, waken the dead. But I stood helpless and did not know what I could do. I looked into myself, and the only thing I found within was the memory of earlier dreams, all of which I wrote down without knowing what good this would do. I wanted to throw everything away and return to the light of day, but the Spirit stopped me and forced me back into myself. So I thought that was interesting. I hope you find something interesting in that, and you can obviously relate it to Peterson. Now I'm going to go to Jordan, so I think this is probably the most relevant clip here, and then I'm going to go to the Joe Rogan clip.
There's an idea right at the beginning of Genesis. I lectured about this a lot last year, that there are 3 elements that are involved in the generation of being. It's not the same idea as the construction of the material world. It's not the same frame of reference. It's a different conceptual scheme. It's one that assumes that consciousness is central to being rather than a secondary epiphenomenon. God is a paternal figure in Genesis, a structure. God the Father is a structure. That's one way of thinking about it. And the story is that whatever this paternal structure is, patriarchal structure, let's say, uses a process, logos, to interact with chaotic potential to generate habitable order. And I think that that's an accurate way of looking at things, is that in order for there to be, there has to be a structure, there has to be a process, and there has to be something upon which that is acting. And in Genesis, that's...
Now I'm going to get into the structure in this Joe Rogan piece with Eric Weinstein. That's why this is sort of relevant, and that's why it's going to be relevant also to the Peterson Paradox video series that I'm doing.
It's the tohu vabohu, that's the chaotic potential, and it means without form and void, but it also means potential. And so there's this idea that God as a structure uses the logos, which is something like creative, communicative speech, something like that. It's broader than that. It also means the tendency to explore, and it also means truth. It means all of those things at once, to interact with potential and to generate habitable order. And then there's an insistence in the same story that when that process occurs properly, which means that it's created by the logos, then the habitable order that is created is good. One of the things I learned from Solzhenitsyn, and also from Viktor Frankl, and other observers, Jung as well, Carl Jung believed that psychotherapy was unnecessary if it could be substituted, if a sufficient moral effort could be substituted. So he thought of psychotherapy as a fundamentally moral process, and really believed that it was a consequence of truth. And I would say that's true of all the clinical psychologists and psychiatrists that I've studied. In the final analysis, their fundamental claim is that something like a combination of courage and truth is redemptive. It's very interesting because it's a restatement of a very old idea. It's the oldest idea in the West, perhaps, that courage and truth are redemptive. Certainly if you're in Freudian psychoanalysis, you go into your past and what you haven't yet been able to process because perhaps you've avoided it. That might be repression. I think it's not a bad example of repression, although sometimes you avoid because you cannot understand, and sometimes you avoid because you will not understand. But the confrontation with what you found intolerable in the past is curative. And then that's generalized across the psychotherapeutic disciplines, because in every psychotherapeutic school, there are certain truths that are intolerable in some sense that you're encouraged to voluntarily confront and to analyze, and then to articulate, and then to accept, and then to adapt to. And so there's definitely a call to courageous, truthful being in the psychotherapeutic process that looks to me like a recapitulation of a much older religious idea.
And you'll note how Jung in the Red Book ended that passage by the call to wake the dead. The dead past, Blake says the past is just dead. It's not living. It by definition can't be living. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting little clip. This whole talk is very interesting, and his Q&A is very interesting. So if you haven't watched this and you only have an hour, I would definitely recommend this. Now, about this, the nature of reality, here is Eric Weinstein looking at it from a different perspective, from the scientific perspective.
The three most important equations in physics.
Now, when you say three most important in how it's applicable to everyday life, or important in how it's given us an understanding in quantum physics, or important how its understanding is significant to quantum physicists?
We're talking about bedrock reality. Like you and I are having a conversation, and if you're a Matrix fan, in what we might call the construct.
Okay.
What is the construct made of? So the way I do it is I think of it as a newspaper story. There's where and when did it happen. There was who and what was involved, and there's how and why. Okay. So where and when.
Now this is what I was going to get into, and what I will be getting into in the next Peterson paradox video. And I think it's interesting how Weinstein thinks about this here. Of course, you learn in grade school the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Those are your questions if you're a journalist, right? Those are the facts, right? So, and you should be able to answer those, right? So he's going to try to answer them as a scientist, but I think for some reason he seems to confuse what these things actually mean. Like, I would say he's answering what, and what. There is no who. I mean, he's anthropomorphizing. He's anthropomorphizing these bits that the universe is made of, if it's a who. And, maybe he's doing that intentionally just to get the point across. Maybe it's easier to understand it when you anthropomorphize the bits. But I just thought it was kind of odd, but here, have a listen for yourself.
Space and time, clearly. The who and the what, to me, let's say the who is the spinorial stuff. It's like electrons, it's protons, neutrons, quarks, the stuff that we're made of. And then you and I are only able to see each other because we're passing photons back and forth, which are force particles. They're not spinorial. They come back to themselves after 360 degrees. They don't require 720. So this is sort of the, if you were going to go to a play, you'd have the dramatic personnel of the play given to you at the beginning. So this is what this universe is. It's a story about space and time, where and when, about what is in that, like who are the players and what equipment are they using. That's like bosons and fermions. And then there's the how and the why, which is the equations and the Lagrangians.
Did you see how he said, he starts off, I think there was a more clear analogy there, that, this is the play, this is the narrative, it's sort of presented to us, it is a drama. So, but he says the who in the drama are the bosons and the quarks. I thought that was really peculiar. I mean, it fits what he's saying, but it's not going to fit what Jordan is saying, and if Jordan was there talking to him, he goes, yes, this is a drama. There is a narrative here. The narrative is the ultimate reality, the highest truth that we can gather, given our evolutionary structures and so forth, and perhaps other things. But I just thought this was kind of a weird way of saying it, but interesting nonetheless.
Govern the rules of play. So for example, if you and I, go to the beach and we've got a ball and a net, and you think we're going to play volleyball, and somebody says, no, we're going to play sepak takraw, which is like volleyball played with the feet in a martial arts style, which is awesome.
Yeah, we've showed a video on that recently. I believe it's from Thailand or Bali or something.
They're really good at it.
Amazing.
It's amazing. It's like ballet, martial arts, soccer, it's volleyball all happening in one thing. We should do this as a nation. That's a different set of rules for a ball and a net and two teams that you could have done it one way as volleyball, and you could have done it another way as sepak takraw, where you're using your feet and not your hands. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the breakdown of what a physics theory is. You got to tell me where and when. You got to tell me what's in the game, and you got to tell me what the rules are. And that's what this place is. And so theoretical physics is the most interesting of all of these fields to me, not because it speaks to us about our daily lives, because it speaks to us about, well, where are we? Where is this thing taking place?
So it seems to me that there's a...
And yes, I think that's very interesting. I like the way he explained it as we're in the construct, like, how Morpheus explains it to Neo in the movie The Matrix. But in a lot of senses, the building that you're in, let's say it's a building, the where, is not all that interesting when considering the story that's taking place within by the who of the story, the us, it's the human beings. The story taking place inside the building is a lot more interesting than the brick and mortar of the building itself. And I think it really goes to show you the type of mind, as Jordan Peterson says, there are types of people and minds that are very interested in the things. And they tend to be male, they tend to be the engineering types. I have quite a few in my family, actually. And then there's the other part is the people who are interested in people and tend to be female and so forth. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. But for me, and I think for humanity, the real question is not an engineering question or a physics question, like he's saying, explaining what building we're in. It's the why and the who. It's the why and the who. So it's the telos, it's the purpose. Science cannot answer purpose except in a very strange way. It's a very scientific way of answering purpose. But I'm going to get into that in the Jordan Peterson paradox video. But I just thought I'd introduce it here because I thought it sort of fit with Jordan listing these sub-queries of morality, of what should be done, your motivation for motor output and so forth. I thought it fit here, and it's going to fit there in the other video series. So I think that's all I have for today. Again, like and subscribe. Thank you.